Hello, and welcome to this month's CFX Connections webinar. My name is Stephanie Lippy, and I'm the conference manager for Church Facilities Conference and Expo, and I'm so happy to have you guys join us today. Today, we are discussing stage drapery and the fire code. During today's webinar, we do encourage you to use the chat options to connect with other attendees and to share your thoughts on what is being presented. Also, if you have a question you would like to have answered, please enter it in the chat box and we'll address it as we have time. Feel free to put those in there. We'll ask them in the midst of the moment if need be, or we can save them until the end if that's a better time to fit them in. If you would like to check any other resources out that may be discussed throughout this webinar, we will have all links to those resources listed on our webinar page at churchfacilitiesexpo.com. And a recording of today's webinar will be shared with each registrant in a few days. Okay, so it is my pleasure today to introduce you to Brad Davies. Brad is a great guy. He is involved with On-Site Drapery Cleaners, a company that has been the experts in same-day curtain cleaning and flame proofing since 1978. Having tested and retreated thousands of textiles, Brad has years of field experience and has also published numerous articles on flame retardant testing and treatment. He's been invited to discuss the fire code with many school boards, theater groups, and fire prevention officers. This is such an important topic to make sure that we discuss today that most people don't even realize is an important topic to discuss in their churches. So Brad, thank you so much for joining us, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks everybody for showing up. It's nice to virtually see you all. I'm going to move pretty quickly today to take you through some technical stuff as it relates to stage drapes and the fire code. So I'm going to move quickly just because there's a lot of content. So save your questions and we can revisit anything that you need to go back over later on, or of course you'll be able to reach out to me directly via email afterwards if there's further questions of that nature. So let's get started. So where we're supposed to be right now would be on the trade show floor, meeting each other, talking to each other in person, making new friends. Where we are is here. And so I think we're all pretty familiar with the working from home and the Skype and the Zooms and all that stuff to really change the nature of our work. But it is what it is. So here we are today, we're talking about the fire code. What I'd like you guys to get out of this session today would be to understand a little bit more about what the fire code requires. So it's what, where, which test, and when. And I'm going to summarize that, taking into that detail. I'm going to talk a bit about flame retardant treatment, so the background, the composition, how they work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to properly care for your stage draperies. So let's keep going here. So the risk is pretty simple, is that all drapes are flammable. Most drapes are made out of cotton. Cotton is flammable. In an assembly occupancy, in a large room with large curtains, it represents a large amount of combustible material. And so in the past, there's been some terrible disasters related to textiles catching fire in theaters and that kind of stuff. And so on a theater stage, you've got lights, you've got props, you've got electrical sparks, you've got all kinds of additional elevated risks. And so in response to that, there's been a fairly long history of codes to protect the public from the disasters that have happened in the past. And so all the way back to 1938 is when the Nfpa first started adding requirements for textile flame proofing. Excuse me. So to dive into the fire code, so the majority of the jurisdictions in Texas are governed by the International Code. And so the International Code specifies, the first question is, so what does it specify? And so it's drapes, curtains, nettings, and decorative materials, textiles and films. So that would include artificial plants, any sort of films, hanging, screens, and of course, stage draperies. The next question is the where. So generally speaking, assembly occupancies are considered rooms that hold more than 100 people. And also, of course, the hallways and exits of any public buildings. So those are the ones that would apply mostly to this group here. Have to be a pretty small church to have less than 100 people in it. And so the question is, which test And so when you get a brand new drape, the NFPA 701 is the one you should be concerned about. And please do not buy a drape if the vendor will not supply an NFPA 701 certificate, because that is the most commonly asked for stage drapery certificate. Any vendor who does their stuff will know this and will provide proper documentation. There are also a few other tests which are mentioned in fire code, and so they're all listed out here. I'm going to take you through some of the details. So first of all, the NFPA 265 is something where these are wall coverings. And so, for example, if you had a drape hanging on a wall, it would apply. And essentially, there's a fairly rigorous burner test that has to be done on that fabric. That's something that's commonly found in the building code. So when your church was built, they would have known these criteria and looked for that. Same with the NFPA 289. So this one is meant more for things like artificial foliage and such, that kind of stuff. We don't need to get into the details, just to know that there are a large combustion involved in this test. The 701, again, this is the one that you really should be focused on. This is the one that most fire inspectors, fire marshals are going to be asking for. And so, again, make sure that when you buy new draperies that you're going to get this certificate. The 701 test, though, as you can see, requires 10 samples of 6 inches by a foot, roughly. And so to take that from an existing drape would be considered destructive to the drape. And so what the NFPA has come up with is NFPA 705. And so NFPA 705 provides a small scale test to provide an indication of flammability. And so that sample is a 1/2 inch by 4 inch in size, and it requires the use of a kitchen match, not a Bunsen burner. And so the advantage of that is that it can be done in the field. Quite often fire marshals themselves will take that piece and put a match to it to determine flammability of drapes. But this one is most commonly done in the field. This is one of the ones that we do. Certainly after we finish cleaning and treating a stage drapery, we're going to test it to make sure that it complies with this particular code. And the good news is, since the piece is so small, you can take it from the hem. A small piece can be taken from the hem without destroying the drape itself. So the last question is the when. And so the fire NFPA advises that the drapes should have their flame retardant renewed such that they meet NFPA 705. So the 705 is the test that we just talked about. And typically all stage drapes are going to need to have some sort of servicing every 5 years. There is a type of drape called inherently flame retardant drape, which is not cotton, it's made of a synthetic fabric fiber. And those types of drapes will retain their flammability, their non-flammable properties, except when they become dusty, because the dust is dirty and is accelerated. So in the case of IFR drapery, sometimes you can just clean them without having to reapply any flame retardant to them. The other requirements in the International Fire Code talk about sprinklers. So depending on the size of your stage, sprinklers are typically required. If there's not sprinklers in your assembly, then there's a limit to the number of drapes you're supposed to have on that stage, which is just a main, border, legs, and one set of rears. There's also rulings around how much of a wall space. So if you had, again, like a textile hanging on a wall, could be a tapestry, could be a drape. It can't take up more than 10% of the wall area is the idea, except, of course, in Group A auditoriums, which you can get 75%. So that's like a theater, and a theater typically might have soundproofing drapery along the walls, and so they're allowed to have some of that. And of course, don't drape over the exit doors. Not a good safety policy. So I'm going to dive into a bit of the background on the stage drape fabric themselves, where they come from, and that kind of stuff. And so the drapes themselves that you're buying are either natural or they're synthetic. So the natural ones are typically going to be cotton. There's also some wool drapes out there. There's also on stages, and also some fiberglass drapes, which are natural material, but more of a woven fiberglass type fabric. And then there's the synthetics. So synthetics are all derived from petroleum products in one way or the other. Nylon, polyesters, or acrylics. Typically speaking, it used to be that the natural fabrics were the dominant fabrics used, and nowadays overall textiles have moved to synthetics. And the production base has shifted from North America to Asia. So most of the fabrics that we're buying here today are produced in Asia. We like to buy the American fabrics, but most commonly available are Asian fabrics. The stage drape, so there's a couple different types there. So the stages are either going to have the velours. The commandos are usually the ones in the rears. The scrims or the muslins are the scrims in the back for projecting onto. And then there's wool. And so the cotton and the wool is the most common and most commonly used on stages. So talking about those drapes and their flammability, so a heavier drape is going to be less flammable than a light drape. It's because of the weave of the fabric, and so it's less likely to ignite than a looser weave. And also the texture will affect the flammability. So puffy materials will catch more than a flat surface. So moving on now to the fabric types and treatments. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's two types of ways of making a drapery flame-proof. And number one is it's an applied, so it's a chemical that's applied to the drapery, typically at the mill when the drape is manufactured. And so what happens is that fabric, once woven, will go through a dipping process and coat it with a flame retardant, which we'll get into in a second. And then the synthetic fabrics are typically inherently flame retardant. And so what that means is that there's flame retardant properties which are woven right into the fabric itself. And so that means that they won't typically combust. And we did mention earlier is that all drapery should be cleaned and recertified every 5 years, just because the dust is an accelerant and is highly flammable. And so it's the dust that we need to be concerned about. And so both types of those drapes, FR or IFR, should be tested annually. Most big theaters will test the flammability of those drapes every year. And if necessary, they should have a new application of flame retardant applied to them. We also want to make sure that drapes are not ripped because unfinished edges will burn differently than a sewn hem. And as a general rule of thumb, if the certificate and the drapery is more than 5 years old and hasn't been treated since then, it should definitely be retested and likely is going to need cleaning and retreatment. So the flame retardant itself, we talked a little bit about the types. The chemical is, there's a wide variety of chemicals that are used. Typically, you're talking about a thermal shielding. And so what's happening is you're going to coat the combustible portion of the fabric fiber with a mineral-based chemical, which essentially prevents the flame from accessing the flammable portion of the drape. So that's the cotton fabric fiber. And so it basically makes a shield that will slow, not prevent, but slow the combustion if they are exposed to lights. There's a bit of poor history around flame retardants, or like maybe a bad name, I guess, is in the 70s, the California issued a technical bulletin which mandated the use of flame retardants, and the ones that they mandated ended up being found to be carcinogenic. And so these were found in things like, kids' cribs and pajamas and toys. And so it was quite the scandal when it came out in the 70s. And so there's a lot of residual resistance to flame retardants because of that negative history. But those particular types of flame retardants have been banned since the 70s. You can't buy them. They're not available on the marketplace. And so it's worth mentioning just because we've encountered lots of concerned parents regarding the use of the flame retardants. So it's important for them to know that the stuff that we're using is really chemically similar to salt. It's kind of like bromine that goes into your hot tub. And so it's not carcinogenic or hazardous. And so that because of this, the California laws have changed a little bit. And so now that California doesn't mandate the use of flame retardants, they just mandate a certain flammability characteristics of the products manufactured. So it's much better and non-hazard. So the ones that we use and that are used in the industry are mineral-based, as I mentioned, and they're not volatile organic compounds, so they don't off-gas and they're not hazardous. The SDS sheets that we use say basically don't drink it in large quantities. So it's a very safe product to use. It's not in any way a toxic thing. So we're talking a bit about treating the drapes now and how to care for them. So when you treat a drape with new flame retardant, it needs to be cleaned. The manufacturers of the flame retardant all specify this, and the reason is because, as you can see here, that with those blotches on that drape, that what's happening is the flame retardant, when sprayed on a dirty drape, will congeal around the dust and leave those blotches there. And essentially what's going to happen is that drape, as it's moved, is going to it's going to fall off. The dust combined with flame retardant will fall off and render it to be ineffective. And so the drapes do need to be cleaned first. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit on care and maintenance here for drapery. So for you guys, we would suggest that annually vacuum them or beat them, but don't use the broom that you use to clean the floor. Get a new broom. Don't get them dirty. And in general, just keep the stage clear. And if you do come across rips in your drapes, they're only going to get bigger. So it's important to maintain take care of the small rips, because they will get bigger. And then annually, we suggest you test them for flame retardancy, which is something that we can help you with if you're interested. And then every 5 years, typically the drapery should be, the flame retardant on the drapery should be renewed. So if it's inherently flame retardant drapery, simply taking it down and cleaning it will remove the combustible dust, and then it should pass. And then in the case of a flame retardant treated material, the drapery needs to get cleaned, and then it can be resprayed with flame retardant. But you should be warned that flame retardant is water soluble. So if it goes into a dry cleaning machine or a washing machine or even a steam cleaning machine, it will extract the flame retardant and compromise its ability. There's also some effects of the flame retardant can be affected by overly humid areas, which if you might have seen like that kind of blotchiness that I showed you on that blue drape, you see that kind of stuff where the flame retardant sort of washes out even just in a high humid environment. If you're folding your drapery, label them all, put them in such a way that you can see where the header is and the ties, so you can tell which type of drape you're accessing here. And just fold them neatly is what we represent, and don't wrap them in plastic because you don't want them to absorb moisture and get wet. Moving on here, so how to clean drapes. I'm just going to take you through this again pretty quickly. So drapes, most drapes have never seen liquid before, and so what that means is that if they get wet, when they get wet, they're going to shrink. This picture here doesn't show very well on the slide, but there's about a foot gap here between the drape and the floor. And the reason for that is because these drapes were washed. And so again, in this slide, you can see this drape here was the one that was cleaned in our system, which won't shrink. And this one here was the one that was washed. And you can see clearly it's quite shrunk. So in the case of this stage here, these drapes are basically useless because you can see right underneath them. It also can lead to this kind of puckering along the hem, which is because it's shrinking unevenly, and that's all caused by the washing. So the next idea would be the dry cleaning curtains. And so traditional dry cleaning is using high temperatures and chemicals to extract and to clean. The problem with dry cleaning machines is their drums are typically quite small, and so they can't handle a very large stage drapery. And you add to that the chemicals that they use for dry cleaning can interact with the flame retardant that's in the drape. I'll just show you a picture here. See this blotchiness that's created. This is the combination of the dry cleaning fluid not being evenly extracted from the machine and a reaction with the flame retardant itself. And so these drapes that we came across cannot be fixed. We tried to get those stains out. They're permanent. They've permanently ruined the drape by dry cleaning it. The next option would be, people might consider, would be steam cleaning, but because carpet drapes don't have a hard surface behind them, steam extractor is able to insert the steam into the drape but not extract it fully, and so you end up with a very, very heavy, very moldy drape, and you're pulling out the flame retardant. So it's not recommended to steam clean curtains. And then the vacuuming, of course, we think vacuuming is a great idea to do on an annual basis as a preventative measure, but it, in our opinion, doesn't do a good job of removing embedded dust. And again, it comes down to the idea that there's no hard surface behind that drape, and so moving this little wand up and down the large curtain is really not going to be a very effective way of extracting the embedded dust and that kind of stuff. And they really shouldn't be laid on the floor. You really shouldn't walk on the drapes. And so the only way to clean them is to hang while they're hanging. But again, it doesn't lead to consistent results. And if this technician misses a swath with his vacuum, especially on a black stage drape or a red stage drape, there's going to be a blotch there and a stain when the flame retardant is applied onto a dirty section of the drapery. So that's not advised. Here's some examples of drapes that have been cleaned. So you can see these are these streaks that are from the vacuum itself, unevenness, and then these are some of the more congealing that we saw in the earlier one. And again, it's just because the dirt hasn't been fully extracted and therefore ends up with a problem. So of course, as you probably predicted, we have a solution to this stuff. So we have these machines, which are non-emergent drapery cleaning machines. And so we use powder and air to clean the drapes. So in these drums is a very large tumble drying drum. It's about 48 inches in diameter, so quite large. We can handle about 1,000 square foot stage drapery in a single load. So a pretty big drape. And so the drapes go into this drum, and what happens is it rotates 10 seconds one direction and 10 seconds the other direction in order to make sure that the drapes don't get tangled or bound up upon themselves. And then we spin up a blower motor, which is about 3,000 cubic feet of a minute of air. And so we are pulling air through the door, which has tiny holes in it, through the drapes, and then through a series of holes in the fins in the drum. And that goes into a filter to filter out all the embedded dust and soil. So the amount of pull we're using, that forced air extraction, is roughly 30 times more powerful than a vacuum. So we really are pulling a significant amount of air through, which extracts all the embedded soil and that kind of stuff. And so, excuse me, you can see on the left, or sorry, on the right here, the before and afters of a couple of the drapes that we've done. Really makes them pop, look like brand new once you extract all that embedded dust. And because we're not using liquids, we will guarantee not to shrink your drapes, because it's impossible to shrink the drape because we're not getting it wet with anything. So that's a big advantage. Also, the no color fade or bleeding, which can happen in a wash or in a dry cleaning. We also guarantee not to damage the fabric. And most importantly, when it comes to your stage draperies, is that we're not going to take out the existing flame retardant from the drape. And so that is a big advantage from safety. So again, most of the flame retardant is water soluble. So if it's cleaned by any other method, then it will be compromised. And so our system enables us to, if we do have to spray more flame retardant on a drape afterwards, we don't have to build it back up from zero. So if you wash it, you got to build it back up for zero, which could lead to multiple applications, which could lead to staining. So you really don't want to do that unless you have to. We also have a large drum and high capacity, and so we can handle large amounts of drapery in a small amount of time, and we're not crowding the drum with inserting too much fabric fiber in there so it can't clean. And the last advantage we're pretty proud of is we're green, completely green. So we're not using dry cleaning fluid. We're not using water. We're not using soap. We have saved over 120,000 gallons of water last year compared to our process, or $40,000 gallons of perchloroethylene, which is the dry cleaning chemical. So that's really wrapping it up. I'll give you just a brief summary of what we went over here. So the fire code requirements were what, where, which test, and when. So the what is drapes, curtains, textiles, banners, flags, wall coverings, artificial foliage, Christmas trees, all those kinds of things, quilts, all those kinds of things. Where, mostly for you folk, we're talking about the assembly occupancies and the lobbies and exits of your worship facility. And then, so the next question is which test, and so it's the 701 that you really need to be concerned about. For certainly, if you are buying new stage drapes, I would insist on having a 701 certificate, otherwise don't buy them. And on a go-forward basis, it's the Nfpa 705 that you should be doing to make sure that the flame retardant capabilities are maintained over time, and they don't, because they will wear off. And so the when is subjective, but in our experience, 5 years is a pretty good indication of when they should be cleaned and retreated. You can test them and then find out if they fail, then they need to be retreated. If they pass after 5 years, you might get another year or two out of them. But again, we would recommend the annual testing. Talked a little bit about the flame retardant treatments. And so the drapes are either inherently flame retardant, which means that the fabric fiber itself has got a woven flame retardantness built into it. Those drapes typically are a little bit more expensive than a FR drape. And to the pure theater crowd, don't have the same light and sound absorption capabilities as a cotton drape. And so the cotton drape is an FR drape, and so that's a flammable fabric fiber, which is then dipped and coated in a flame retardant, which renders it FR. And then we talked a little bit about care and handling of your stage drapes. So every year we think you should test them. Every year we think you should beat them or give them a quick vacuum just to get the surface dust off. And we think that you should pay attention to this kind of stuff every 5 years. And so that's the cycle that seems to be pretty reliable out there in our field experience. And of course, the non-immersion cleaning is the way to go on the stage drapers. So coming to the end here, this is just some pictures of our unit, one of our units. And so these units would come right to the stage, or if you're not in one of our geographies, you can ship your stage drapes to us and we will clean them, flame retardant them, and send them back. So I think that's it. And I don't know if there are any questions, but I haven't seen Stephanie pop up with anything. So if there's no more questions, I'll say thank you for attending, and I wish you all a great day.
Well, we did have one question, but you answered it before I was able to ask it, so that was great. It was just oh my goodness, the cost differences between flame-resistant synthetic versus cotton standard. So,
yeah, I would say it's about a third more to buy the IFR draperies, and a little bit more limited selection of colors and stuff like that. So you can get more variety in the FR draperies as opposed to the IFR draperies. But again, the IFR draperies don't need to be reflame proofed on a go-for basis, just clean, so that they do have that advantage.
Great. And then I had one question specifically. So you mentioned this certification. Where do you service all over the United States, or is this something that are there companies within each state that people would be able to find to help them get the fire certification that they need?
Yeah, great question. We have operations in the Midwest, the Southeast, and next month, Texas. So those are the geographies that we cover. So we're mobile. So we would go, for example, from Chicago to Ohio, and so that kind of geography. From a testing standpoint, if anybody wanted to have some testing done, they should reach out to me, and they could simply just send us a sample in the mail, and we can give them instructions as to how to extract that sample from their drapery. And then once we test it, we have an indication of the flammability. If they can give us the measurements, then we can get them a price. And if they were in our geography, we would bring the truck to the church and take them down and clean them and flame proof them same day. If they were not in our geography, then we would ask the worship facility to take them down, ship them to us. We will clean them, flame retard them, and then send them back for rehanging.
Okay. For testing in general, is that something that, like, for example, any fire marshal would be able to do, or is that something specific that a very specific company would have to do? What are some of the standards there?
Yeah, good question. So the field flame test, which is the 705 test, which is a small sample with a match, that one is done by fire marshals and people in the industry, such as myself. You would learn how to do it through the Nfpa procedures and then follow those procedures. They're fairly straightforward, and it doesn't require things like humidity control and temperature control. All the other ones that I mentioned, so that's the Nfpa 701, the 268, the 265, all of those ones have to be done by an accredited lab in controlled conditions. And so there's restrictions on the humidity of the fabric sample before it's conditioned. It has to go into a sealed air room. Some of them are measuring things like the amount of kilojoules of heat that are generated from the package, the flammable testing. And so those ones do need to be done by an accredited lab. And so those are guys like, one of them would be Exovia, I believe is a name, a national lab. And so if you just Googled up NFPA 701 testing labs, that I'm sure there'd be several of them that would come up. And so the more rigorous tests like the 701, that's meant to be done by the person who made your drapes. It's not meant to be done by a church themselves, because again, you're going to need a whole yard of fabric basically from your drape to conduct that test, and you're going to send it to the lab, and it's going to cost about $1,000 to get that result. So that's where the 705 comes in, where you're testing a sample literally this big, and it doesn't have to be done in temperature controlled conditions. And we charge $200 for that 705 test. So it's much more practical, and it has the advantage that it will not destroy your drape, because you don't have to take a square yard out of your existing drape.
Okay. This is all really, really fascinating stuff, especially I know for those who aren't in the theater industry and they don't necessarily have this kind of background, that I think this is just really, really great information. So thank you so much, Brad, for joining us. If people have questions later on, what's the best way for them to be able to get a hold of you?
My website, which is onsitedraperycleaner.com, is probably the best thing, or just Google On-Site Drapery Cleaners. We should likely come up. And on there is a contact us link. Those info emails come right to me anyway. So yeah, if they just hit the link on our website, it'll come right to my inbox. Perfect.
Well, thank you so much again. And I just want to thank you, all of you, for attending today. And we also just want to encourage you to join us next month. We will be connecting with Tyler Reagan, and he's going to be sharing how to lead things you didn't start. So make sure you subscribe today to learn more and be the first to find out when that webinar is coming. Thanks everybody again, and have a blessed day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.